All right, so I don't know, several years ago, I was really into like paper engineering and pop-up books and things like that. And I found this great book, Paper Engineering. The nice thing about this book is that every page is an example of the thing that you're going to make, and then you make it in the book. So this would tell you like how to make these 10 working models, and each one teaches a different principle, but they're very simple. So like this one here is just showing you how to make like a little pop-up, and then you actually make it on, you cut the pieces out, and then you make it on the next page, so that when you open up the book, you'll have like your own magic box will appear in the book. There's nothing like fancy or decorative about this. It's just like this is a very functional foundation. If you want to make pop-ups, you need to learn this fold, and you need to learn how these pieces go together, and this book will kind of teach you that. And this is really kind of the metaphor for this talk, that I wanted to make games that teach the fundamentals of games. So they're very stripped down, they're very basic, but the idea is you learn by playing and doing. Like this pop-up book, you don't just read about how to make a pop-up, you actually build them. But everyone's very simple. So real quick, I'll go over the overview. I'm just going to talk about the class that I teach and why I even teach it. All right. I'll talk mostly about the fundamentals of game design, and there's kind of two levels to take this. One is I'm going to be teaching you about game design if you're not really familiar with it. More importantly, though, is kind of the process of teaching the fundamentals, as opposed to what I'm going to be teaching you by teaching the process of teaching. If that makes sense. The talk can get very meta at times. And then I'll just kind of run through the games that I teach at the workshop. Then kind of wrap it up at the end. So I've done these classes. I started at a school called Cogswell College down in Sunnyvale, where I live. The 15 years of teaching there. The game design workshops at GDC, if any of you have been to those, are usually tutorials on Monday and Tuesdays at the Game Developers Conference. I've been doing those for about 15 years as well. Game Connection, just at EA when I was working there, we had a mentoring program. I run some of these exercises at Riot now. So they're kind of been very field tested. I've gone through a lot of revisions of these things. So an individual workshop is like no computers, just paper, cards, and dice. The idea is to get down to the very basics. We don't want to get distracted by electronics and things that can crash, and I forgot this file and all this other stuff. The workshops are about 2 to 3 hours long to give enough time to really like understand the topic, but we're not trying to make final complete games that you're going to ship, so we don't need to go much further than that. We're just trying to get a point across. And we're really just going to focus kind of laser-like on one topic each workshop. Like the paper folding thing, we're just saying this is how you build a magic box. That's all we care about in this talk. And then there's no grades. I don't grade any of these workshops. So at the end of the 2 to 3 hours, I don't give the students, say like, oh, you got an A and you got a B for your work here. It's like, you just participated, good job. But there are winners, and by winners, like, we're playing games. So I want there to be some competition. I want the players to really be engaged in the process and not just be like floating off as a game designer. I want them to be in the game, which means that you should try to win. You should be as best as you can at this exercise. So the very first day of class, we do this exercise where it's like, this is an icebreaker. Let's actually get up. Let's wander around the room. Let's not just sit around and like roll dice and flip over cards, and really just get people to know each other and set a tone. And there's not really a game design goal here, other than to say, hey class, we're going to have a lot of fun together in this class, and here's how we're going to do it. It's going to be very hands-on. So this activity is different every year, because if you guys are familiar with Calvin Ball, if you know that game, it just kind of evolves over the course of the 2 hours. And I'll give them some materials. Mostly I just say, you can use this room. Whatever's in this room you can use. In this case, there's a can of dice. And you can kind of see this curtain here. So it's one of the rooms where you could like slide the partition. And so there's another group of students on the other side. They're building their level, and these guys are building the level on this side. And then they're going to open up the curtain and play capture the flag with each other. And this is just kind of the thing they came up with. They started like rearranging the desks and building these forts. Eventually they open the curtain, and now you can see the other team has done something different on their side, and there's this little bit of surprise. It's like, try to get to the other side. We have these dice, so we're going to throw dice at each other, and they use the tiles on the floor as a grid system. So the dice that fall into your grid cell are the ones that count. Everything else just kind of ignore, but it becomes ammunition. And with that, this type of activity is really fun. It used to be when I first started teaching this class, all my activities were like this. Here's some stuff, go make a game, and just have fun, make these games. And I found it was just too open-ended. Like Calvin Ball, it just kind of rambled, and even if I had a subject that I wanted them to focus on, it always veered one way or another. And in the worst case, people start throwing stuff at each other because that seems to be really fun to do that. So, but it brings up the point is what is a game in the first place? I'm going to teach game design. Wouldn't it be nice to know what a game is? And most of the students can't define a game when they come into the class. And it's like, hey, you want to be game designers, but you don't even know what a game is. How can you design something that you can't even define? But it was a good question for myself as well. How do I teach what a game is? And so I started looking at other sources of information for this. There was a magazine called The Duelist if you played Magic cards. And Richard Garfield, who created Magic cards, used to write the end page of the magazine, the last page of the magazine. He would write a little thing about game design there. And I'm like, this is great. I'll just teach the whole class based on Richard Garfield's magazine notes. Wasn't quite good enough for a whole syllabus. Chris Crawford, The Art of Computer Game Design, was another reference that I looked at. Greg Kostikian's essay that he wrote, which is just brilliant. If you hadn't read it, I recommend reading it. Most of these, there was at the time, or 2001, there wasn't many textbooks like there are now. Like right now, if I had to restart the class over again, it would be so easy for me because I wouldn't have to think about it. I would just go pick up somebody's book and I would say, here's the course, somebody's already figured it out. But for me, I'm kind of like piecing together all these little sources of information, trying to say what do I think is important about game design. And it really kind of gets down to this idea that every game can be broken down into these little chunks, a start and a goal. And there's this journey, the game isn't the start, the game isn't the goal, the game is that blue arrow that's going between those 2 points. If you put some opposition, that'll actually make it a lot more interesting, because if you just start and the goal, they're the same, the game is over and there's no opposition. So you want to put something in the way there, which of course then leads to the interesting decisions that you get from Sid Meier, and how do you get around those things. That's all bounded in this framework of rules, which tells you what is the start and the goal and the decisions and the opposition, what frames all of that. And then the last part, the interaction, how does the player input stuff into the system, but equally as important, how does the system put stuff back out onto the player? So it's not just this one-way box where you're just going to dump a bunch of stuff in as a player. The game has to talk back to you somehow to let you know what the state is. And that may be as simple as I'm going to move a pawn from this square to this square. That tells me that a movement has happened. I'm going to pass out money. I can look at your pile of money. The game is keeping track of all of that for you. And it's not just enough to say oh, here's a definition of a game. I'm actually really against the kind of academic definitions of games, and there's a lot of debate if you get on the forums and people arguing about a game is this and a game isn't that, and that's not really a game. Oh, yes, it is. Oh, no, it's not. And I find that really kind of boring to me because it doesn't help. Those discussions don't help me make better games. What do help me make better games, though, is looking at a system like this and not just saying this is a definition of a game, but I want to make each of these things as good as possible. So I would use this as a tool, a guide to say my game is not quite hitting all the right notes. People aren't engaged as much as I want. I can look at these different things and say is the start condition correct? Is the goal correct? Is the decision correct? And if I think of them all as sliders that are going from 0 to 10, then my goal as a designer is to push all these to 10. I want them to all be the best that they can be. And this kind of gives me a framework for kind of bouncing around different parts of the game without getting really confused and just saying, I want to focus on just the rule system today and ignore a lot of this other stuff. All right, so the class is basically going to just be set up as let's have an exercise for each one of these things. And throughout the semester, each workshop will just teach about a different element. So this kind of the first idea of a goal, very important for a game. Why am I even playing it as a player? What am I trying to get out of it? How will I know when the experience ends? So the player needs to know that relationship. So this would be what would take a game from, say, a 0 to a 10 is that the player understands the goal, they know that they're working towards it, and they can see how close they are to it because that's going to build up some dramatic tension. And as you get closer and closer, you want that drama to build and build and build. And that's not saying every game needs that, but the games that have that tend to be more on the 10 side and less on the 0 side of the scale. And by the way, these numbers are all completely arbitrary, but they're just a way, it's I want it to be better than it already is. So the start of a game, and in the class, this isn't really a workshop, but I talk a lot about backgammon because backgammon has this really interesting start condition. Who's played backgammon in here? Okay, who's played with the doubling cube? Okay, so only you guys have played backgammon. The rest of you haven't really played backgammon until you played for money and a doubling cube, the thing in the middle. But anyway, you look at the board and you're if I'm a game designer, that is a terrible board. Like, that doesn't look nice to me at all from a game design point of view. Like, that's kind of cryptic, especially if you haven't played backgammon. You look at it like, I don't even know what's going on there. It looks arbitrary almost. The easiest way to understand it, though, is if we were to take this board and kind of look, black is taking those two, or brown is taking those two pieces and moving them around, all the way around to the other side, and then white is trying to go the opposite direction around from, starting from the two and going everything off the edge of the board there. So wouldn't it be better to actually maybe break this board up and kind of divide it like this and say, now this makes a lot more sense to me because brown is going to go this way and the tan color is going to go the other way. Why is it even folded in the first place? Well, because this is a really long table. Isn't it nicer to have your board kind of compact where you just sit and you see everything? So there's reasons that it's folded around. But it's also kind of strange to like, why does it start like that? Like, I'm a game designer, I can fix this terrible starting condition. Everything should just start like this. This makes so much more sense to me, where brown is over there and tan is over there. Like, this cleans up a major problem in backgammon. Now I can just start the game right away. I don't have to think about where the pieces all go. But if you play this game, and it turns out historically an ancestor of backgammon was a game much like this, it's kind of boring the first few turns because there's no conflict. You're trying to get your pieces across. The conflict comes when they hit in the middle. So at some point, some ancient game designer was like, you know what, this game's better if we start like this. We can, now on turn one, there can be conflict. We don't have to wait 10 turns for there to be conflict. We could just fight at the beginning because fighting is the exciting part of this game. And then, who knows, 100 years later, somebody might be like, why don't we move more stuff over? We'll just like cross it over. We'll like move, and let's only have 2 guys in the back. That'll be like this little drama. You're trying to get these 2 guys forward. Everybody else is almost all the way there. Really maximizing that drama. All of this game design work, probably over hundreds of years of just small evolutions to get what the standard start for backgammon is now, all has this purpose, which is like, we want to start the game at the high point. We don't want a long build-up. You want to get right into the action as quick as possible. Of course, that all leads to the goal where we're trying to get to. What's that end point? And so the exercise for this is a game called goal cards. All the exercises have really stupid names. Goal cards, I just deal out a card to the player. And the idea is we're going to play the same game over and over again, but all I'm going to do is change the goal on you. And let's see how you feel differently when the goal changes. So no, base rules, once I tell you the rules, you can't change those. But what's the feeling you feel as these goals start to change? And how can we, say, manipulate the player into feeling different emotions just by changing the goal of the game? So the game's really stupid, simple. You put down poker chips and you hit them with your hand and you slide them across the table and you try to knock them into other poker chips. And if you knock them in, you put them in your cup and you score some points for them. And the more points you get in the base game, get 100 points, then you win the game. So we kind of talk about, well, what's the difference between if this is public information versus secret information? Well, let's play those 2 games, one where you don't know how many points you have, and one where everybody knows before you shoot, you have to call out the number of points that you currently have. And how does the drama change? How does knowing where everybody else is compared to like secretly getting points and then trying not to let anybody else know? There's not a right answer or a wrong answer, but the game feels very different. Then we talk about like timed goals. Instead of collecting 100 points, maybe only have 5 minutes, maybe only have 3 minutes. The adrenaline rushes that you get when you put time pressure on people. The difference between what's the goal of the game versus when does the game end? Because the game could end and that's different than what the goal of the game really is. So you can start playing around with these different little bits and pieces of that. Negative goals, things, don't do this or you'll lose. If this happens, you will lose, so don't do this. Multiple goals, all these are all going on at the same time. Sometimes I randomly change them. In the middle of playing, I'll pull one away and I'll put another one up right in the middle of play. It's like, how does that change the behavior? And if you think of games like World of Warcraft and stuff like that, a lot of those games have multiple goals. Or Candy Crush, if you played Candy Crush, there's like all these things that you're trying, that you can do where it's going to change around how you play the game. Then secret goals, you don't know what the other person's trying to do. Everybody gets a card in secret, and then whoever does their thing first just wins. And they're all tend to be really crazy things. So then at the end we do custom goals. Everybody makes their own goal, and we play with those and kind of critique each other's goals and what they mean and how they impact the play. And then the winner of the game, whoever gets the most goal cards, which is the goal of the exercise for 2 or 3 hours, whoever gets the most goal cards wins. And whenever you win the game, you take a goal card and put it in your pocket. The winner gets their card promoted to the next semester's class. So their custom card I put through Adobe Illustrator, and I print it out and I add it to the set with that designer's name underneath of it, so that they become immortalized in the goal game for further generations. So there's this kind of idea of like there's a start and a goal, but really the class is saying like, you know what, you can divide any problem in a game space down to a bunch of sub-goals. So a sub-goal is like, I just want to win a chip because I want to win a goal card, because I want to get the most goal cards, because I want to be the person who gets my card promoted. And so by nesting these goals within goals and sub-goals, you can really engage the player over this long period of time and get these different feels as they go through a 2-hour exercise. Even though the base game is only like 5 minutes long, it feels different. It feels like you're advancing towards something. All right, the next part here is opposition. Of course, if you just immediately get to the goal, like what's the point? So we put something in the way. The idea of flow, which is that if it's too hard, you won't play it because you'll be frustrated. If it's too easy, you won't play it because you'll be bored. How do you tune that opposition? And this sense of accomplishment that when I get around that goal, when I get around that obstacle, I feel special, I feel important. That's something that's going to take opposition in your game from the 0 up to the 10, is the player feels like, I did it, this is great. So the exercise for this one is called obstacle pong. And college students, they know all about this, so they know what to do when you give them a ping pong ball in a red cup. And we just say, like, here's what you do. You're just going to slowly make this game more difficult. So you start with, you just hold the ball over the cup and drop it in, and then figure out how to make it a little more difficult and work your way backwards until it's at that kind of nice tuning of difficulty. Talk about hard and soft obstacles. Like a hard obstacle might be there's just a wall in the way. There's no way you'll throw a ping pong ball through a wall. A soft obstacle might think of it more like mud or something. I have to roll the ping pong ball across some mud or dirt or something, and that's going to, like, you can still plow your way through that, but it's going to slow you down. It's going to maybe present other challenges. And then ultimately, it's like, how does a player have an edge over all these obstacles? Because if your player can't get around the obstacle, they're not going to play your game. So there's this real fine line there of it's easy for a game designer to make a game obstacle so hard that nobody can get through it. That's trivially easy for a game designer. It's really difficult, though, to give just enough of like a obstacle that the player can get through with a little bit of push, a little bit of challenge. And then this difference between opposition and opponents, like sometimes your opponents are your opposition, like in a football game, they're just going to stand in your way. How does that relationship between like just a game obstacle work versus the opponents themselves actively being the obstacles? So this one here, like I said, you just drop it in, you figure that spot out, and the goal is to make a par 5, basically miniature golf course. So you start with par 1, drop it in, that's easy. Then you kind of like, well, what would be the next hardest step? Balance a bottle of water on your head and close your eyes while you throw the ball. Maybe that's too difficult. How do we like kind of tune that down? You get 5 attempts. So the first attempt could just get you close, and then the second attempt you could get it in, and you just kind of work your way back that way. All sorts of things. You have to kick it with your foot, and we're going to fold some paper up. You're going to have to like kick it through these 3 things. Bounce it off these desks over here. Hide the cup underneath of a stool. This one was really cool. They used the same curtains in the room and made this, they turned off the lights in the other room. And so you have to get the ball. You don't even know where the cup is when you first start. You just know it's down that mystery tunnel in the dark. And so there's kind of like, I've got to like get it, but I don't know what to expect when I get around the corner. A little bit of drama there as you work your way through that. So the students are really inventive. But this is really what it kind of gets down to, is this hole right here, which if you can tell what's going on, this is the cup right here. And ping pong balls are really kind of unpredictable. They bounce a lot. And so they had to build out of all this junk paper, they basically built this frame over the course of the exercise to drain the ball into the cup almost perfectly, because they wanted that par 1. It was like, no matter what, I'm going to get it in. And they found that it was really hard to figure that out. So the course is actually longer, and as you work your way forward, eventually you get to this thing. But the idea of like the workshop's about obstacles, but it turns out to be about how do I help the player? How do I get the player to the point I want them to get to? And it kind of twists around. They don't know that until kind of the very end, where then we start talking about like, what did you have to do to make it easy? because it is really simple for the designer to make it hard. Eventually, the meta game for this is that we have built an obstacle course with different teams of like 2 or 3 people in a team all around the school. I teach on Saturdays, so I have the whole school usually to myself, and we can just take over any classroom or hallway or whatever, which is really great. And then you play everybody else's hole, and then as a player, I'm trying to get the best score possible. And there's an award for the person who gets the best score after playing all the holes. And then as a designer, you get a par 5 average from everybody who played your game. That was the best hole. So there's kind of different goals for the player versus the designers, and then we put these all into Excel and we can look at the averages for those. This one here with opposition, this one is like asymmetric game balance, so it's not always, you're playing against an opponent or there's another challenge out on the field. How do we tune for drama so that at that moment there's really this exciting moment of like, I'm about ready to win, are we going to do it or not? We can't wait to find out what happens next. So in this one, the players, actually they're a team of scientists who are building the perfect military robot, and they give this programming sheet, and they kind of fill out this sheet with different things. I won't go into all the details, but basically they're writing a little program that the robot has to follow. And the goal is to march the robot across a chessboard. Well, the goal is actually to get the robot to die on the goal line of the chessboard, because it's really easy to make a program that the robot runs all the way across on the first turn and wins. It's really easy to make a robot that dies on the first turn because you give him 0 hit points and have him turn his back to the tanks. How could you make the robot that's the most Hollywood dramatic robot ever? And that's the robot that gets all the way to the last square on the chessboard, and he's about to die, and the last tank, every other tank has been destroyed, the last tank shoots the shot and then like kills the robot, and that's the Hollywood ending. So they're trying to tune for Hollywood drama in this exercise. And they kind of work on that. There's this set of tanks that they're gonna become tank commanders and fight their own robot in the second part. And so then now they built their robot, they can't change the program, now they're tank commanders, they're gonna stop this robot from marching all the way across the board and see how close it gets. And if the robot's too strong, they have to go back and make it weaker. If it's too weak, they have to go back and make it stronger, and they do this for a while. Then there's certain rules. You can't change the rules of the tank. The tanks are like kind of fixed in their rules, but you can do whatever you want to the robot. Then kind of the twist of the game at the end is that all the robots fight each other. And so the students don't know this at first. They think they're fighting against tanks, but really what I'm having them do is tune their robot to this kind of arbitrary 3 or 4 tank tuning. And now all the robots can fight each other. There should be about balanced with each other because they were all tuned to the same thing. And now at this point, there's no real interactivity at all in the game because they've just written programs. And so we put their robots up and we say like, run your program, let's see what happens. And you would think for a game with no decisions that it would be kind of boring because of course interesting decisions and all of this other stuff that you hear in games. You would be surprised by like the amount of cheering and excitement, and it's like being at the horse races. It's like, we know that the outcome is predetermined, but we don't know what it is. And nobody knows because we haven't run through the system yet. And so at every turn, people are like, oh, he's got him, oh, and it almost always gets down to like 2 robots at the very end, and one kills the other one, and everybody cheers, and it's a super exciting moment, and you're kind of like, that shouldn't happen, really, because you didn't really do anything except run these programs and watch the results, but it turns out to be really engaging. The interesting thing is they all have special abilities that get added on to their basic sheets. And so some teleport, some burrow underground, some have satellite call downs, some self-heal, some can launch mini destroyer drones, and somehow it always comes out to be a very balanced experience because they tuned against that other one, against the tanks. All right, the next one is the decision workshop, where, like I just said, Sid Meier's interesting decisions. Like, you don't want a lot of decisions. That's not high decision quality. You want few, but very interesting. And this idea of like creativity. How can the player creatively get around these obstacles, or at least feel like they're being creative? Even though the designer may know this is what I want you to do, the player might feel like, oh, I did something maybe the designer didn't even know. I like worked around this system, and I'm pretty cool for doing that. Like I hacked Diablo 2 or whatever. So for this one, we work on this exercise called 100 Zombies. It's trying to balance the decisions that are going to go on in the game. And we try to really get expression and role-playing out of this. So while they're playing the game, they're also becoming one of these characters. So I stole these pieces from a board game called Last Night on Earth and kind of repurposed them. So they're the stereotype B-movie zombie characters you would see in a bad movie. And then eventually the characters will combine, which I'll talk about in a second. So this is, again, a very simple game. You're in the middle, you surround the board with zombies, and then you roll a die every turn. And the direction that you roll, in this case a 3, the zombies all move in the 3 direction of the board. And then you roll again, and you roll a 2, and so the zombies all move in the 2 direction on the board. And they're basically a program, so the zombies just do this thing. And then this is the workshop right here. Insert your rules here, and then you'll die eventually if the zombies overwhelm you. So there's a lot of freedom in this, but it really gets down to what decisions can your character make. And if you're the priest, we start out by saying, like, don't do any rule mechanics at all. I just want you to do the stereotype priest verbs. What would a priest do in a zombie movie? Don't talk about dice rolling and hit points and all this other stuff. I just want to know the verbs. And then if you're the town drunk, you might come up with a different set of verbs. And after they're kind of set on the character that they're trying to express, then we get into how can mechanics match those verbs in a way that feels like you really are a priest, or you feel like you really are a drunk while you're fighting these zombies. So then you play out the game, you kind of tune it, you get some information, you figure it out, and then there's the twist in this game is that now I'm going to put your boards together and you're going to work together as a team fighting double the number of zombies. And eventually we put like all the boards together, and then you're working as a team. And so you start to get this collaborative role-playing experience starts to come out of it, where everybody has completely different abilities. But what I found the most satisfying about this exercise is when you know you've hit it, when they're role-playing their characters, when they're talking like their characters, when they're using inflections in their voice, like when the drunks go, like, I'm just drunk, whatever, like I don't care, but some of the priest is like, please God, we need, you get this like feeling of you're in that movie. And in fact, the one we just did a couple weeks ago, it was like a farm girl on a tractor, and she's like driving around. She crashes through the mall, and there's like some jock in there, and they team up, and they ended up with a love story somehow at the end of all of this. And I'm like, that's not in the rules at all. How did these like two characters that have now fallen in love? That has a completely emergent play pattern from a game that's supposed to just be teaching about having these different decision traits, but they've actually managed to express that, and that's a huge win when that happens with any game. Then the framing of it all, the rule systems, how do the rules work with all of this? Make sure we do on time here. Oh, this is 4:15 or 4:30 I have?
Yeah, it's 4:30.
Okay, good. It's going to panic. All right, so rules, this is the thing you see on the back of almost every game at Toys R Us or Target or whatever. You go buy a kid's game, somewhere on it probably says easy to learn, and then what? Yeah, lifetime to master. Like that's like the classic. But it's true, like that's what you want. And for a lot of people, if you don't think about it too much, there's a feeling like you're either easy to learn or you're a lifetime to master. You can't be both. You're either tic-tac-toe or you're chess. But you should strive to do both. You should try to make your game as easy to learn as possible, and you should make it as deep as possible. Don't think of it as a seesaw that one or the other has to trade off. Think of it as like I want to drive both of those as deep as I can. So we do several exercises for this. These are actually done over 3 weeks as kind of a little warm-up activity before the lecture starts. So we're going to how to structure rules, how to organize rules, the precision of your language. We all, if we're gamers, we know about people called rules lawyers. Actually, raise your hand if you consider yourself a rules lawyer. Okay, just a couple people. So yeah, and you probably know, those are the kind of people who like to read rule books. Other people are like, I don't want to read a rule book, tell me how to play. And then the person who reads rule books gets away with murder in that situation. And then how to simplify, make things easy, easy, easy. So the first one we start with is we just start with a bag of popsicle sticks of different colors and sizes, and I write this up on the board, take a stick and make a rule. And that's it. So the first student comes up, grabs a stick, makes a rule. And then their rule, if you take a green stick, then give it to someone else. Okay, if you have 2 green sticks, sing or hum poker face. You must close your eyes when taking a stick. When moving around the room, you must hop on 1 foot. Hum Mary Had a Little Lamb when your eyes are closed. Keep your hands behind your back at all times. If you have 2 blue sticks, you get 10 points. And there's all of this like funny, like you can imagine playing this game, right? Like what's going on, people with their eyes closed, hopping on 1 foot, humming poker face while they're trying to reach for a stick in a bag. Like it's really funny, it's really entertaining, but it's kind of like, what is the goal of this game? And that's kind of the point. Like I let them go as long as possible before I realized it's like, you guys, you're gonna keep making rules that don't focus the game to a conclusion because you don't even know what the conclusion of this game is yourself. You've invented a very interesting, humorous experience, but you're missing that important part of the goal. And plus the rules get harder and harder to decipher, like what's happening when and what's the trigger on this. And so there's been a lot of discussions and arguments about, should you have your hands behind your back right now? Like, is your turn over? Like, we don't know. So the next week we do a simple one, same kind of idea but with dice. And I give them the goal right at the start. Get 50 points in front of you on the dice faces. And the rules have to be followed in order. So you follow all the rules and then you make a new rule. Then you follow all the rules and you make a new rule. And you keep adding. And this is great. We know the goal, where there's never any confusion about what should be happening because you're just going through the turn sequence until you get to the end. But the game gets really cumbersome the longer it goes on, the longer the turns take. It just starts to like drag on, and it can be just like there's just too much stuff going on. So the final week we do a card game. Again, simple goal, try to get the best poker hand. And then we talk about turn orders and how you only get like 3 or 4 slots to make rules. And we can change one of those slots out in the turn order, but we can't add any more than that. And so we're kind of like constantly like, now in this finite amount of space, what's the most important thing? What's the most fun? What's causing the most engagement? What's not? Let's erase those confusing ones and replace it with something else. So eventually we kind of get at an idea of like how to write rules effectively in a way that's easy to understand, that keeps the gameplay flowing quickly, and there's no real confusion or fighting over them all. One of the bigger workshops for this is the Card Wars game, where it's like, now we're going to create modular rules that can be added or subtracted from the game at any time and the game will still work. So if you played Magic cards, that's kind of the idea. It's like, I don't know what your Magic deck is, but I know how to play Magic, so I can fight you even if I've never seen your cards before. How do we balance all of those, though? If everybody's making up their own rules, it could just be chaos. And then what's that process of discussing and clarifying these rules? And then using immersion and flavor to help, or using flavor to help immersion and memory. So this one, basically you assign a rule to every suit. And I won't go through all of these, but each one has their own take. So like arrows would be about attacking things. Diamonds would be about like getting points and money. So just some examples from previous years. Clubs are about getting more cards in your hand. And hearts are usually about giving, but they usually end up giving something that's not really great to the other player. And so it's basically the game of War. We've all probably played the game of War when we were kids. You flip over the top card of your deck and whoever has the highest number wins. But if I flip over a heart, this rule would trigger. For me only, not for my opponent. And we each have our own set of these special rule cards that we bring with us. But to keep the balance interesting, when you design your cards, we then shuffle them and pass them out randomly to everybody who's playing the game. So you don't want to make the uber rule that like, when you flip over a heart, you win, because you might not get that card. In fact, you probably won't get that card. And then throughout the course of the gameplay, every time you play, the game only takes like 3 minutes to play because you're just flipping over cards until you get 10 points. Then you and your opponent talk about that rule and whether it was balanced or not, whether you think it was too strong, too weak, and then you just get your pencil out and you change it, and then you go to the next round with somebody else. And after about 2 hours of cycling around the room, you end up with this really balanced set of cards that are all about at the same power level, depending on whether the players felt like they wanted high power or low power. It might tune differently from class to class. Then the last part here is the interaction part. How do we really like talk to the game, and how does the game talk back to us? And how easy is it to get input into the game? How does the game reward the player for playing? What kind of output is coming that the player feels like, wow, that was great. I liked when that happened. The game has rewarded me somehow. And how can we get the atmosphere to be very immersive? So this is one of my favorite exercises of the semester, the roll dice fast exercise. We were talking about this at lunch. That rewards can be super powerful. So I make this game that's like roll dice. Everybody has a pair of dice. Roll dice as fast as possible. And if you get a double six, called freeze and get a chip from the table. And you would think that's it. Like roll dice as fast as you can until you roll double sixes. That's it. And you would think from all theories of game design, this would be the worst boring game. There's no decisions. Basically, the only thing you can do is roll faster if you want to do better. And I can get people to do it for 30 minutes. Actually, the class, I tried to see how long I could take it, and they played for an hour. And this is like, they're rolling dice, trying to roll double sixes for an hour, standing up. None of them even looked for a chair. They were all standing up. Like, just imagine standing up for an hour. Already that alone seems daunting in our day and age, right? And so the fact that you can get people so engaged that they don't even look for a chair, that they're still like rolling dice really fast for an hour, So how the trick works is you start out with like 20 poker chips in the middle of the table, and you say play the game until all the poker chips are taken from the middle, because somebody rolled double sixes, and then the game's over, whoever has the most wins. And you play that game. It's like, that's pretty fun, okay, crazy fun. But now that was the warm-up, we're really playing for cookies. And then I take 20 cookies and I put them out on the table and say, now we're playing for cookies. And everybody's like, cookies? I love cookies. I'm hungry. I'm a college student. Of course I want cookies. So they roll dice and they're really engaged and they're talking about their cookies, how they can't wait to eat their cookies and all this other stuff. And then we switched up to quarters. I throw 20 quarters out in the middle of the table. And by now they're like, this game's really good. This game, I'm going to tell my friends about this game. This game is so much fun. And then when they're done with that, and it's like, okay, we're all done. Well, let's do one more. And I throw out $20, 21s on the table. And they're just like, oh my God, I got to play this game. Like they're so energized. It's not like I'm tired. I've just played this game for 45 minutes. I don't want to play for another 15 minutes. Instead, it's just like, I can't wait to play. Let me in there. And what's happened over the years, I used to kind of be the guy who stood back, the guy with the white lab coat kind of clipboard idea, right? It was like, look at these rats that I'm running through this maze by giving them rewards at certain frequencies. But then I realized I'm losing cookies and I'm losing my own money because I contribute all this money. So I started playing it just to get my money back. And it turned out the game's really good. Like the game is really fun. Even though I know all the tricks, I actually can get really engaged by the game too. I want to roll fast. I want to get that money off the table as well. So it's kind of a great lesson. It's easily worth the whatever $25 in cookies and quarters I give out. So then we start getting towards the end of the semester, the exploring the different combinations of things. Like how can we affect the atmosphere? How can we control moods of players? What fonts, what images, what colors can we use in our games to make players feel certain emotions that we want them to feel? And this exercise, I just had them bring in a board game. The previous week's homework is like, your homework is to bring in a board game. Easiest homework ever. Then they all come in with their games and we combine them together into crazy things like Jenga Battleship and what was this one? StarCraft plus Gloom, if you played the card game Gloom. Trivial Pursuit plus Pandemic, yeah, so Trivial Pursuit Pandemic. Settlers of Catan plus this war game, that's German kind of Nazi war game, Tannhauser. You're running around in the Settlers of Catan world shooting people. And so, yeah, so we'll spend a lot of time just talking about you have all these pieces. You can't play with the actual rules of the game. You have to make your own rules to the game, but it's required that you use some pieces of each game. And then what moods do those evoke? It's basically the backwards way you should make a game by most textbooks. You should make the game first in pencil and paper and as cheaply as possible. And then when you're all done, then go out and do high quality stuff. And it's like, here's a whole bunch of high quality pieces, make a game out of them and see what happens. This one, basically getting into more of the math, like how do we control odds and statistics. And the problem is that I find a lot of my students aren't mathematicians. A lot of them are, there's always some programmers, they're great. Then there's a lot of artists and just people who don't really like to do math at all. And this can be a problem when you're trying to teach statistics. So I really wanted to make a type of game that you could learn about odds and statistics without doing any math. And based on, this is where I said the talk can be kind of meta sometimes, because the way that I teach this exercise is by the Pong, obstacle Pong game. It's like, what's a par 1 problem that I can teach you? And as soon as you understand that, let's step back for a par 2 problem, and then a par 3. And during the lecture, I'll make it harder, slowly harder and harder to see if I can kind of ramp you up to understanding these things. And then simulate thousands of playtest sessions. So of course you always want player feedback, but you can only do that so many times with the limited amount of time that you have. So wouldn't it be better to just have the math tell you what would happen in your game on average than to play thousands of your own game and see what happens that way? So I used to, you give out these problems and don't worry about what the problem is or how it works. But what I found is that almost all the students either didn't do it or got it wrong or didn't really care. And there's always be the programmers usually can get them right. But it didn't really seem, it was a homework. It was like, go do this at home and bring it back and we'll talk about the answers. And it really wasn't very effective. So I started working on kind of this other, the par 1 game is, what are the odds if we play a game where we each roll a 6-sided die that you'll win if you roll the higher number? And if it's a tie, re-roll. And everybody's like 50-50. And it's like, well, draw that chart for me. And then they have to draw the chart out and figure out the odds. And hey, it works out. There's 15 red X's and 15 black X's. So yeah, let's count them as 50-50. Then I have them make their own die that has to add up to 21 like a normal die does when you add all the faces, but they can put whatever they want on whatever face. And so you might go with like 3 sides are 0, a 1 and a 10 and a 10. And then they make the chart for that. How does that compare? And they draw the chart out, and then they figure it out, the odds. But before they do the chart, I have them play for a few rounds and then predict who they think is the better die. And then after they've done like 10 or so rounds and say like, whose is better, blue or white? Then they guess, and then they try to figure out how close they were. When they do the math, the simple kind of math of just putting X's in columns and counting, then they see whether their assumptions were right. And it's not always right because 10 sample sizes is so few. Then you play. Everybody goes around the room and plays with each other's dice and try to like figure out the odds. And you kind of like step up that way to slowly learn how the game works. I'm just going to buzz through these because I'm almost out of time here. Then we play a game with, instead of rolling randomly, you get to pick which one of these numbers to put down on the table each turn. And unlike the dice where every round is the same odds over and over again, as you start to use up your numbers, as you play your numbers like the 2 and the 4, those columns are never going to show up again. Black will never play another 2, red will never play another 4. And so the odds have changed from round to round, where red is only 43% likely to win and black is 57% likely to win. But on the next round, when black plays their 6 and red plays their 2, then the odds change again. And so you can kind of calculate from round to round how that change is happening just by counting X's on a grid. We eventually kind of advance up. There's a few other little exercises along the way, but we eventually advance up to like, you have these 4 dice, put them on a spaceship for how good your shields are, how good your engines are, how good your guns are, and then go around and fight other people with this kind of simple battle game. And at the end, then we ask the question like, which one's the best? What's the best configuration for a ship that will win most of the time? And inevitably, everybody says something different because they haven't had enough samples to go through the whole exercise. So then we break out Excel, we talk about how to make the charts, using the same idea but just a little more sophisticated, and show them like, now I can run 1,000,000 games in Excel and I can tell you with decimal point accuracy which one of these is better and which one you should always make if you were to play this game in the future. All right, and the final little bit here, just kind of wrapping up, we do, towards the end of the semester, we start doing projects to kind of combine all this stuff together. So one of these is this casino game where they have to build a little casino that they're going to then play everybody else's games. And there's 2 goals for it. Well, first of all, you might want to make a game that's obvious and simple to play, and people will be enticed to come sit down at your table and give you their money. It's all Monopoly money. And you then, as a casino owner, you want to make the most profit you possibly can. But as a player, you want to make the most money that you can. So you're kind of like going around the room trying to take advantage of everyone's weaknesses in their casinos. And the casinos, of course, like I can make a game that takes your money every time, but a player will only play that once and then they'll get up and leave. So I need to reward you, but if I reward you too much, I'll lose money. So here's just some examples of some of the games they make. They're all kind of a little rough, but they'll put a little theming around it. They'll try to get, they'll do their kind of like a showroom thing of like, come over here, we got the best odds, sit down, have a nice seat, hey, want a drink? Like they'll do whatever they can to get people to sit down and then do whatever they can to keep them from getting back up again, playing these different games. All right, so I'll just kind of wrap up there. Real quick, like I said, there's kind of 2 talks going on here. One is about like, oh, here, you just kind of learned about all these games that I teach. Having me talk about them, of course, isn't really good. Like, you should play them, and they're really easy to play. So if you're interested in any of these, just try them out, and you'll see, like with the goal game, for instance, like you'll actually feel those emotions of the time pressure and the adrenaline, or the more relaxed strategic kind of things. The things that I present here are not like, oh, these are these shipping games, you better follow them exactly because this is what I said these should be. I change them around every semester. I'm constantly tweaking them, manipulating them, and if you want to try any of these yourself, then you should have that same spirit of like, Stone said that was good, but I didn't really like it. Well, just change it. Like, I don't care. Like, I'm not going to sue you or anything. And then if you already are a designer and you know a lot of this stuff that I've been talking about, then I really recommend becoming that teacher in your company and taking some of these exercises and giving them to the QA team and running them with some of your producers or people who aren't into game design, your programmers, your artists, to educate them about it as well. And there's some benefits, of course, just having the teamwork within the company, but just that play that comes from that, and then the knowledge can make everybody appreciate the design even more. So I'll leave it at that, and stonetronics.com is my website, and most of these exercises are up there in some form or another. So feel free to just download them, or you can just send me email at stone@stonetronics.com, and I'll be happy to talk to you about any of these. All right, so that's it. So I think we're exactly on time. Maybe sneak in one question if there's anything. Otherwise, you can just come up and talk to me afterwards.
I definitely recommend if you have programmers to force them to do this module, because the amount of programmers I've met who couldn't write a rule book to save their life, but are writing rule books for the PC to follow is amazingly.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of surprising, because you would think like the programmers would be the best at writing rules, because that's what they do all day long. But yeah.
Well, they can write code. They don't understand that. Most of them don't understand how clear rules lead to better code.
Okay.
They look at what the designers are producing from the design document, and they try to emulate that, but they don't get to they can't figure out how to do that elegant step.
Okay. All right. So, all right, thank you very much.